Welcome everybody to Enumerating IPv6 hosts for large-scale security scans via DNSSEC-signed reverse zones. This is joint work with Shuang Hao, now at the University of Texas Dallas, Tobias Fiebig, who visited us briefly at Santa Barbara and is at TU Delft, as well as my advisor, Giovanni Vignier. Starting at how the internet looks today, we basically, as an end user, you get a public IPv4 address, and then at home, for example, you're just using an internal network. For instance, in the 192.168.1 range, for example, a /24. At this point, basically the attack surface is pretty much limited to your only accessible, externally accessible host, which is your router, or whatever you might have firewalled through or allowed to access, go through your NAT. And at the same time, this is also what we can look at and evaluate, measure, and scan, for example, through ZMap. If we look, however, at how this changes for IPv6 specifically, then suddenly an end user does not only get a single public IPv4 address, but instead they're getting a single IPv6 network, which is usually taking to the power of 64 different kind of addresses. So at this point, the motivation is that you have enough addresses, so you can just use public addresses everywhere. All of the devices that you have at home can now suddenly be publicly reachable. And we care about this because this increases your attack surface to basically everything that you have. Rather than only your router being accessible, everything could theoretically be reached by an attacker and thus be attacked. And at the same time, we can't actually scan any of this because the IPv6 address space is so vast, we have no reasonable way to just ask all of the devices that are there whether they might be running, for example, a vulnerable version of a specific software. Overall, we have to start caring about this because if we look at generally the IPv6 penetration, IPv6 is getting here. Some might say it's already here. And it's not going to actually go away. For example, Google is seeing around 21% of all of their traffic already being on IPv6. Over 50% of the entire country of Belgium is delivering IPv6 connectivity to end users at their ISP. And I'm not sure how many of you are using T-Mobile or Verizon, but if you are, then you're probably also having an IPv6 address on your smartphone. And considering that you will just have more and more devices on the internet, which not necessarily now, but for example, in 5 years down the road, might be vulnerable because if it's an IoT device, the vendor might have gone bankrupt and might never have been patched since. We might end up in a situation where suddenly a lot of IoT devices would allow us to actually launch significantly more powerful distributed denial of service attacks. The question then, of course, becomes, is there some way that we can actually look at the entire IPv6 address space? And overall, it's around 2 to the power of 96 larger, so you have around, in comparison to IPv4, you get around 340 undecillion addresses compared to 4 billion addresses. Of course, we can't just go and ask all of these addresses to whether they might be running a vulnerable version. So IPv4 style brute force scanning that we're doing right now, that we're kind of used to, as in the case of ZMap, doesn't really work anymore. So is there some way that we can actually enumerate IPv6 addresses or part of the IPv6 address space that we could use for scanning, basically to narrow down the search space initially? And this is largely where we can actually rely on the domain name system. And just to recap very briefly, the domain name system just basically maps a name to an IP address. In the case of IPv6, it would be a quad A record, which in itself could already be used to collect IPv6 addresses that you might want to scan. Unfortunately, this has some problem. Once, there's a question, where would you collect that DNS data? I don't think that the majority of us have access to some kind of higher up recursor, either at IBM, Cloudflare, or Google, for example. And even if we would be able to collect data there, that would largely be biased towards clients actually trying to resolve specific servers. Which means the question becomes, is there something better that we can do? Is there some kind of different source in DNS that we could use, for example, to get IPv6 addresses? Fortunately, there is. So there's the reverse DNS, which basically, rather than mapping a name to an address, does the inverse, so it just maps an IPv6 address to a specific name. And the way this is organized in the DNS. So it's just basically a completely different zone. Rather than being .com, it's a subzone under .arpa, specifically IP6.arpa. If we recall, an IPv6 address has around 32 nibbles, which are 0 to F, and they're split at each nibble for the subzones. And the idea behind reverse DNS is actually pretty old. It started basically being used for troubleshooting. So for example, if you ping a host, you might realize that if you ping an IP address, the command actually tells you a host name. Similarly, it's being used for logging, where you just actually want to have meaningful logs, where it might tell you where this host might be coming from, what the meaning is. Then, of course, you have the standard use case of anti-abuse, which means forward-confirmed reverse DNS, so that, for example, a mail server knows that they're actually able to send or supposed to send emails from a specific domain. But knowing how the reverse DNS zone for IPv6 is organized, we can actually understand that if we can do a zone walking attack on the reverse IPv6 zone, then we can actually use this to enumerate IPv6 addresses that are not necessarily active, but at least allocated, and somebody went through the pain of actually setting up reverse DNS for them. While we can't necessarily do zone walking on DNS itself, we're in luck because, fortunately, DNSSEC and NSTIC specifically actually started to allow to do it. So DNSSEC basically just introduces cryptographic signatures for DNS records so that you can prevent hijacking, which your ISP might be doing to inject, for example, ads. But most importantly, DNSSEC encourages you very strongly to use offline signing. And that's actually the thing that they're saying specifically on the RFC, you should be using offline signing. But if you use offline signings in the case of DNS, this actually makes denial of existence of records significantly more difficult. A denial of existence is basically just an X domain. If you would try to use an X domain with DNSSEC, you suddenly would need online signing because you would need to know what users are actually querying for. And you can't just use all of them. You can just basically generate signatures for all of the possible domains that somebody might be querying for. So what they introduced with DNSSEC was the next secure record, which is basically a record that's there for an authenticated denial of existence. And NSTIC itself works by simply saying, hey, 1.ip6.arpa to 3.ip6.arpa doesn't exist. But at the same time, it leaks us the information that 1.ip6.arpa as well as 3.ip6.arpa exist. So suddenly we can get rid of 2.ip6.arpa, and we would just need to look at 4.ip6.arpa. And this is effectively a zone walking attack. Of course, people started to realize this on the forward zone, that you can basically use this to start enumerating that there's a login subdomain or there's an authentication subdomain. So they introduced NSTIC-3, which was meant to actually prevent zone walking attacks by hashing. The way that an NSTIC-3 record looks like, it basically just takes one hash and then points to a second hash, which is the next hash. And specifically, it also introduces a salt. It specifies the hash algorithm. In this case, it's SHA-1. And as far as I know, it's the only one that's supported by the RFC for DNSSEC, so it's still only SHA-1. It has some additional flags, and it sets additional iterations. And then if you want to check whether a domain actually does not exist, you would just verify that whatever domain you queried for, so in this case, this is just query, that the hash of this, given the parameters of the NSTIC-3 record, falls between hash 1 and hash 2. But if you think about this a little bit more, then you actually start to realize that this does not actually prevent zone walking attacks. But what it actually does, it hides the information from you by hashing, which means you can still actually collect all of the records, you just don't know what's behind them. So you could, of course, use a brute force attack to just try to enumerate all of them, which in the case of IPv6 would suddenly be 2 to the power of 128 bits, which is still smaller than the SHA-1 search space, and there's actually no reduction in there, so you can could do this. Similarly, you could do dictionary attacks, and that's what people did on the forward zone. And effectively, you just start collecting the NSTIC-3 chain, so basically hash 1 pointing to hash 2, pointing to hash 3, pointing to hash 4, until it loops back and points back to hash 1. And then you try to search through the search space somewhat intelligently offline. If we look at this in more detail, the first step, online collection, basically starts because we can rely on IPv6.ARPA actually not having any other records than 0 to F, because it's a well-organized zone. We can just query for anything differently. We could query for foo-bar, we could query for UCSB. Any of that would just immediately give us an NSEC3 record, which tells us the seed, the hash algorithm, the number of iterations. And then ultimately we start generating locally some kind of names, and we check whether they fall into some kind of hash gap where we don't know whether there might be a record before or after. And then in this case, for example, we start with the initial set. So in step 1, we're getting the seed. In step 2, we might be getting, essentially after the first gap, we might get hashed address 1, which goes to hashed address 2, and then we start generating a new hash, which falls, which is lexically after hashed address 2, and would loop back to hash address 1. And then we start going through the chain and collecting more and more hashed addresses. And ultimately, this actually needs around our queries that we need to do online, and all of the hash calculations, which are on average, all of our log R, that we can do offline. So we actually only need to generate as many DNS queries as there are records in the zone. And the record in the IPv6 reverse zone is either a network, a delegation, or an address itself. So at this point, what we have collected is basically a chain of addresses. So if we take the example from before, which is also in the paper, we have, for example, hashed address 1 pointing to hashed address 2, pointing to hashed address 7, to 3, to 4, to 5, to 6. And what we actually want to get out of this is we actually want to get plain IPv6 addresses, right? We don't, the hashed address doesn't really help. They won't help us to actually scan part of the IPv6 internet. As I've mentioned, we could do brute force. And at 2 to the power of 128, that's better than going through the entire SHA-1 search space. But it's still a huge effort that we don't necessarily get through, particularly, for example, iterations counts are high, salts are differing, or a hash function is getting more complicated. We still have the benefit, though, that we don't need to actually generate 2 to the power of 128 different network packets, but we can do all of this offline. So at least on that front, it's already a minor improvement. But if we look back at what the NSEC3 record gives us, actually, we can actually do this a little bit more cleverly. So rather than just looking at and trying to brute force the entire address space, what it actually tells us is that there's going to be a pointer record and an RR-SIG record at hash1.ip6.arpa. And we can exploit this knowledge because the IPv6 reverse zone is actually well organized. So they have specific meanings in the case of ip6.arpa. And specifically, a pointer record means it's an address, while an NS record means it's a delegation, which in the majority of cases is a network prefix for IPv6. So in this case, if you look at the top of the slide, hash1.ip6.arpa actually points to an IP address. So we know that it's going to be a specific IP address, and we might also be able to determine a prefix previously. And this allows us to actually split the search space into a search space for network prefixes, as well as a second search space that we can use for full addresses. And then there's also the knowledge that IPv6 addresses and networks are not randomly assigned. Nobody just picks a random prefix or address out of this entire and large pool, but rather you can exploit, for example, that they're manually signed. A human might assign them and just go with increasing numbers. You might have been using DHCP version 6, or you might have been using stateless address auto-configuration. And if you combine these two key insights, then you can actually combine them and reduce the search space for IPv6 networks, leveraging the collected information to around 2 to the power of 33 and 2 to the power of 39, which suddenly becomes significantly more tractable to actually brute force. And so what we did is to actually look at whether this works feasibly. We started to evaluate it a little bit and looked at some specific networks. And we looked at some specific networks because we wanted to see whether we can target the enumeration, whether we could look at only enumerating a specific network rather than having to search always through the entire IPv6 address space. Specifically, we looked at 5 different networks. So we looked at one of the earliest adopters of IPv6 in France, which was an internet service provider. We also looked at a Ukrainian local internet registry, a European domain registry, as well as a supercomputer facility in the US and a university in Germany. All of the findings that I'm talking about here, as well as the other ones that are in the paper, we of course responsibly disclosed. And to better understand how IPv4 and IPv6 might differ, or whether a security vulnerability or an open port that we're seeing on IPv6 is actually intended to be accessible from the outside, we looked at hosts that are dual stack, which have a single IPv4 address as well as a single IPv6 address. And looking at what we've actually found is it seems that IPv6 security at this point is still far worse than IPv4. And you can find basically all the things you don't actually want to find on the internet. You can IPMI access, so you can get remote keyboard video monitor access, as well as powering on servers or powering them off. You can still see access to SSH version 1. You can still get telnet access to apparently Cisco routers. You can look and see unrestricted access to the Nagios remote plugin execution engine, as well as SNMP, while we didn't really know whether it's read-only or read-write, because we can't just write something to an SNMP port on the internet. That would be entirely unethical. They are already indicative that there are problems in the way IPv6 is currently being deployed. And one of the reasons that we looked at, and that seemed to be one of the core reasons and causes why this is happening, is that IPv6 takes on public IP addresses by default. There are a lot of devices which, if advertised to route to the internet on IPv6, just suddenly are part of the IPv6 internet. And some system administrators just really are not aware of this. And then there's also always have been the more imagined problem of stateless address auto-configuration, of allowing tracking of people across networks. And we actually saw one of the cases where some phones as well as notebooks actually moved from one building to the other across lunchtime. And then essentially after 6 p.m. they disappeared entirely, which is kind of a good amount of an indicator that it actually does allow tracking of people. Of course, our approach does still have some limitations. So there's certainly an issue in possibly completeness, as in not every IPv6 address is required to have a reverse DNS record. There might be addresses that don't have that. Similarly, some of the reverse zones that are below IP6.ARPA are not guaranteed or do not have to actually have DNSSEC. Some subzones don't necessarily need to be signed. Fortunately for us, this is actually expected to improve over time. And at this point, it's only 51 out of 59 of the delegations that exist currently for IP6.ARPA that do not have DNSSEC. So we are at 51 out of 59 that are signed. And then there, of course, there are some mitigations. So for example, there's NSEC and NSTIC3 white lies, as well as there's NSEC 5. But both of them actually do require online signing. And as I mentioned initially, the RFC strongly discourages you to do online signing because of reasons for compromise of key material, because they don't want you to have the negative performance impact, as well as because it allows basically oracle queries through a cryptographic signature scheme. And overall, the mitigations, while they exist, have not actually been widely adopted. And this is largely because there has been a lack of industry interest. So standards has been proposed, so there are RFCs for them. But so far, industry doesn't really seem to care that much. Fortunately, interest seems to actually ramp up. So that's good for people who want to protect themselves against essentially enumeration. But I think we're still at the part where this is going to take a good amount of time until it actually happens. So ultimately, what I did talk about today is a practical method to actually collect active IPv6 addresses through reverse DNS, and it's only providing an initial step to actually get better visibility into IPv6. We have some empirical evidence that IPv6 is insecure by default in a variety of cases, and there are some deployment issues with IPv6, as well as that some of the devices do not have privacy extensions for SLAAC, so the tracking is still possible. There's also the benefit that the approach that I talked about doesn't actually require you to have a network vantage point, because you don't need to collect DNS data in a passive way, for example, at a DNS recursor, but you can actively query the zones and enumerate this yourself. And lastly, because we think that this is going to help basically bringing a large part of IPv4 scanning to IPv6, We are going to make the data that we've collected, as well as regular snapshots of new scannings that we're going to do in the future, publicly available on the website ipv6.farm or ipv6farm.org. With that, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, so we're going to just move straight on to the next speaker. Let's give Kevin just one brief round of applause.